Stop scrolling for a second and look at your eyes in the nearest mirror or the camera reflection on your phone. If they're green, you're looking at a trait that fewer than 1 in 50 people on this entire planet carry. Not blue, not brown, green. It is the rarest naturally occurring eye color in the human species, and for most of history, nobody could explain why it existed at all. People blamed it on witchcraft, on cursed bloodlines, on spirits slipping into a newborn's body. The real explanation sat hidden in human DNA for thousands of years, and it was only decoded within the last 2 decades. What scientists eventually found wasn't just an answer about eye color. It was a map of ancient migration, written in a place nobody thought to look, and it leads through a part of the world most people never associate with green eyes at all. Before we get into the biology, it helps to understand just how rare this trait actually is, because the numbers surprise most people. For comparison, red hair, which most people already think of as unusual, shows up in roughly 1 to 2% of the global equal population, concentrated heavily in populations with Celtic and Northern European ancestry, and it comes from an entirely different gene called MC1R, which affects the type of melanin produced rather than the amount. Left-handedness, another trait people commonly describe as rare, actually affects around 10% of people worldwide, which makes it far more common than green eyes. Green eyes sit in rarer territory than both of those traits in most parts of the world, which is part of why they've historically drawn so much attention and, in earlier centuries, so much suspicion. Brown eyes dominate the human population. Depending on the region, somewhere between 70 and 80% of people alive today have brown eyes. And in parts of Africa and Asia, that number climbs even higher. Blue eyes are the color most people think of as rare, concentrated hias, finally in Northern and Eastern Europe. But they still make up close to 8 to 10% of the global population. Green sits far below both. Most population studies put green eyes at around 2% of humanity worldwide, and in some countries, the number is close to 0. That scarcity is exactly why ancient cultures reacted to it the way they did. In medieval Europe, a woman with green eye has ran a real risk of being labeled a witch, simply because the trait was unfamiliar enough to seem unnatural. In other traditions, green eyes became linked to envy and jealousy, which is the actual origin of phrases like green with envy and the green eye, head monster, both of which trace back centuries in English literature, including to Shakespeare, who used the phrase in Othello to describe jealousy itself. The association between unusual eye color and supernatural danger wasn't limited to Europe either. In parts of the Middle East and South Asia, the belief in the evil eye, a curse said to be cast through an envious or malicious gaze, has ancient roots stretching back to Mesopotamian and Greco-Roman sources, and in several regional folk traditions, light-colored eyes, being rarer and more visually striking, were specifically singled out as more likely to carry that power, whether the person intended harm or not. Blue and green glass, as amulets meant to ward off the evil eye, still commonly sold across Turkey, Greece, and the wider Mediterranean today, are a direct cultural descendant of that same anxiety about unusual, pale-colored eyes. For most of human history, that kind of folklore was the only explanation anyone had. Genetics didn't exist as a formal scientific field until Gregor Mendel's pea plant experiments were rediscovered and popularized in the early 1900s, and the specific molecular mechanism behind eye color remained a complete mystery for another century after that, with the genes actually responsible not identified until the 1990s and 2000s. In nearly every culture that encountered someone with green eyes before then, the explanation offered wasn't biological at all. It was moral, spiritual, or supernatural, because that was the only framework anyone had. Geography adds another layer to the mystery. Green eyes aren't spread evenly across the world. They cluster most heavily in Northern and Western Europe, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia, where local surveys have found green eyes present in a notably higher share of the population than the global average. Move east or south from there and the frequency drops steadily, and by the time you reach East Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, or the Americas prior to European colonization, green eyes become extremely uncommon. That pattern is not random. It reflects the movement of specific populations and specific genetic variants over thousands of years, which means eye color is, in a very real sense, a visible record of who moved where and when. To understand why the color exists at all, you have to start with something that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. There's no green pigment in the human eye, none. If you examined a green iris under a microscope and tried to isolate a green dye or a green pigment molecule, you would find nothing, because it isn't there. The color you're seeing is the product of physics, not paint. The only pigment involved in eye color is melanin, the same molecule responsible for the color of your skin and hair. Melanin comes in shades ranging from yellow-brown to black, and the amount of it present in the front layer of the iris, called the stroma, determines how dark or light your eyes appear. High melanin concentration produces brown eyes. Very low melanin allows a different phenomenon to take over. When there's very little melanin in the iris, incoming light doesn't get absorbed the way it does in a brown eye. Instead, it scatters off the fibrous tissue of the stroma. Shorter wavelengths of light, toward the blue end of the visible spectrum, scatter more easily than longer wavelengths, so more blue light bounces back out toward an observer. This is called Rayleigh scattering, and it's the exact same physical process that makes the sky appear blue during the day, even though the atmosphere contains no blue pigment either. A blue eye, in other words, isn't showing you a blue substance, it's showing you scattered light. Green eyes take that same scattering effect and add one more ingredient, a small amount of a yellowish pigment called lipochrome, sometimes referred to as pheomelanin in some scientific literature, sitting in the iris. When that yellow pigment combines optically with the blue produced by light scattering, the result reads to the human eye as green. It requires a very specific, narrow balance. Too much melanin, and the underlying brown tone overwhelms everything, producing hazel or brown. Too little melanin with no lipochrome, and you get blue instead. Green only appears in that narrow middle zone, which is a major part of why it's so much rarer than blue. The genetics behind this balance point to two specific genes, both located on chromosome 15, called OCA2 and here C2. OCA2 provides the instructions for a protein involved in producing and distributing melanin within the iris. Researchers sometimes describe it as controlling the volume of pigment produced. HERC2 sits right next to OCA2 on the chromosome and contains a regulatory region that acts like a switch, controlling how active the OCA2 gene is allowed to be. A specific variant within an intron of HERC2 can reduce the expression of OCA2, meaning less melanin gets produced in the iris, even though the OCA2 gene itself isn't damaged or mutated. It's the equivalent of a dimmer switch wired into a neighboring circuit rather than a broken light bulb. It's worth pausing here to correct something a lot of people still learn in school. For decades, eye color was taught as a simple example of Mendelian inheritance, with brown treated as dominant and blue as recessive. In a tidy pattern anyone could diagram with a Punnett square, modern genetics has shown that this model is far too simple, because eye color depends on the combined activity of OCA2, HERC2, and several other genes with smaller individual effects. Two brown-eyed parents can, and regularly do, have a green-eyed or blue-eyed child if both parents happen to carry a copy of the relevant reduced activity variants without showing the trait themselves. This is why eye color can seem to skip generations or appear unexpectedly in a family tree. It isn't a single on-off switch. It's closer to a dial with several hands, adjusting it at once, which also helps explain why green eyes, requiring a narrower combination of settings than blue, are so much less common. This is where the most well-documented part of the science comes in, and it specifically concerns blue eyes rather than green. In 2008, a team at the University of Copenhagen, led by geneticist Hans Eyberg, published research examining the DNA of blue-eyed individuals from across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Eyberg had been studying the OCA2 region since the 1990s, and his 2008 findings showed something striking. Nearly every blue-eyed person in the study carried the exact same variant in the same regulatory region of HERC2. Not just a similar mutation, but an identical one, down to the same single nucleotide. Because random mutations, essentially, never land on the exact same base pair independently in unrelated populations. The most logical explanation is that this variant arose once in a single individual, and was then passed down through that person's descendants across thousands of years and enormous geographic distances. Eyberg estimated the mutation first appeared somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, likely in the region north of the Black Sea, in the area spanning modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, based on genetic diversity patterns and the archaeological timeline of Neolithic population movement in that region. His often-quoted line summarizes the finding well: everyone with blue eyes descends from a single common ancestor. Green eyes are a more complicated story. And it's important to be precise about the difference, because a lot of popular science content blurs this line. The single ancestor finding is well documented for blue eyes specifically. Green eyes rely on that same general reduction in melanin, but they require an additional and more variable factor: the presence and amount of lipochrome pigment, along with fine adjustments in melanin levels that don't reduce all the way down to the blue extreme. Because more genetic variables are involved, green eye color is understood by researchers as a more polygenic trait shaped by OCA2 and HERC2, alongside contributions from other genes still being studied, rather than tracing cleanly to one single founder mutation the way blue eyes do. What connects them is that both are downstream of the same broad category of mutation, a reduction in the melanin-producing activity that once made brown eyes universal in ancient humans. Before this mutation family appeared, geneticists believe every human being had brown eyes, going back to our earliest ancestors in Africa, where high melanin levels also served a protective function against intense ultraviolet light. That raises an obvious question. If reducing eye pigment doesn't improve vision, strength, or any obvious survival function, why did the trait spread and persist instead of disappearing within a generation or two? Researchers have proposed a few explanations, and they aren't mutually exclusive. One centers on geography and sunlight. As early farming populations moved north into regions with weaker sunlight and long winters, natural selection favored lighter skin because it allows more ultraviolet light to reach the skin and support vitamin D production, which is essential for bone health and immune function. Since skin color and eye color share overlapping genetic pathways involving melanin production, lighter eye color may have spread partly as a byproduct of selection acting on skin tone rather than being selected for directly. The other lead-in G explanation involves sexual selection. The idea that in populations where a trait was new and visually distinctive, individuals carrying it may have had a reproductive advantage simply because they stood out. This hypothesis, notably proposed by researcher Peter Frost, remains debated among geneticists, and most current experts consider the truth likely to be a combination of both mild selective pressure and simple genetic drift, where a neutral trait spreads through a population partly by chance as that population expands. Whatever combination of forces kept the trait alive, it did not stay confined to Europe. Around 5,000 years ago, pastoralist populations from the Pontic Steppe, the grassland region north of the Black Sea, began a series of large-scale migrations associated with the spread of Indo-European languages. Ancient DNA studies published over the past decade, particularly research from the Reich Lab at Harvard and collaborating institutions, have shown that these steppe populations, often referred to by the archaeological label Yamnaya, contributed enormous amounts of ancestry to both later European populations and populations across Central and South Asia. As these groups moved east into Central Asia and eventually into parts of South Asia, they carried their genetic variants with them, including the light eye-associated variants that had emerged in or near their homeland. Archaeologically, this expansion is associated with the Yamnaya culture, known for constructing large burial mounds called kurgans, and for being among the earliest populations to make wide use of domesticated horses and wheeled carts, both of which allowed them to travel and settle new territory far faster than earlier farming populations on foot. Ancient DNA extracted from burial sites across this region shows the steppe-related genetic signature apt, occurring suddenly and in large proportions in both Bronze Age European skeletons and, further east, in Bronze Age skeletons recovered from parts of Central Asia and southern Siberia, confirming that this wasn't a slow trickle of contact, but a substantial demographic expansion. Centuries later, the trade routes, collectively known as the Silk Road, which connected China to the Mediterranean world from roughly the 2nd century BCE onward, created additional channels for genetic exchange between European, Central Asian, and South Asian populations. Wherever merchants, soldiers, and travelers moved and settled, gene flow followed. In certain isolated mountain regions, this ancestry became concentrated rather than diluted, because geographic isolation limited interbreeding with surrounding populations. The clearest example sits in the Hindu Kush mountains of northern Pakistan, in a small community known as the Kalash. The Kalash are visually distinct from most of Tibet. Hair neighbors, with a notably higher frequency of light hair and light eyes, including green. For generations, a popular legend held that the Kalash were descended from soldiers in Alexander the Great's army, who marched through the region during his campaign into the Indian subcontinent around 326 BCE and supposedly stayed behind. It's a compelling story, and it's still repeated by tour guides and travel writers today, but genetic research has not supported it. A 2015 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, led by researchers including Kasim Ayub at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, sequenced DNA from Kalash individuals and found no meaningful genetic signature connecting them to ancient Greek populations. Instead, the study found that the Kalash split off from other regional populations generally 11 to 12,000 years ago, and share genetic drift patterns with ancient northern Eurasian hunter-gatherers, suggesting they represent a highly isolated, long-separated population rather than descendants of a 4th century BCE Greek army. Later genetic studies, including more recent work using autosomal and Y chromosome markers, have reached similar conclusions. The Kalash carry Ditpobet, EP West Eurasian ancestry that predates Alexander by thousands of years, concentrated and preserved through centuries of genetic isolation and a tendency to marry within the community. Their green and light eyes are not a souvenir of a specific historical army. They're a preserved fragment of a much older and broader ancestral stream that moved through Central Asia long before written history began in that region. The Kalash aren't the only example. Similar concentrations of lighter eye color show up in scattered communities across the Hindu Kush and Pamir mountain ranges, including in parts of the Hunza Valley, Nuristan in Afghanistan, and the Chitral district of Pakistan. These regions share a common thread: rugged, mountainous terrain that limited contact with surrounding populations for long stretches of history, allowing certain genetic variants introduced during earlier waves of migration to remain at higher frequency than in more connected lowland regions, where genetic mixing diluted them over time. This process has a specific name in population genetics: the founder effect combined with genetic drift. When a small group becomes isolated from a larger population, whatever genetic variants that small group happens to carry become the entire genetic starting point for everyone descended from them. In a large, freely interbreeding population, a rare variant gets diluted generation after generation simply through the sheer number of people it's mixing with. In a small, isolated population that marries mostly within itself, that same variant can hold steady or even increase in frequency over time because there's no larger gene pool pulling it back down. Mountain valleys, islands, and other geographically cut-off regions are the classic settings where this happens, which is exactly why isolated communities like the Kalash preserve genetic signals that have long since been diluted into rarity everywhere else nearby. One image from this part of the world became globally famous without most viewers ever learning the genetics behind it. In 1984, photographer Steve McCurry took a portrait of a young Afghan refugee girl in a camp in Pakistan, and the photograph appeared on the cover of National Geographic in 1985. Her green eyes became one of the most recognized details in modern photography, and the image is still widely regarded as one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. The photographer didn't learn her name at the time, and it wasn't until 2002 when McCurry and a National Geographic team returned to the region and used iris pattern recognition to help confirm her identity, that the woman in the photograph, Sharbat Gula, was identified. Her eye color, striking as it was to millions of viewers, reflects the same broader genetic history found throughout the region. The tail end of a mutation that likely began thousands of miles away and thousands of years earlier, carried east through migration and preserved by geographic isolation. For anyone watching this with green eyes, the practical takeaway is that you're carrying a genetic variant with a documented, traceable history stretching back thousands of years, tied to population movements that predate national borders, written languages in most of the affected regions, and the vast majority of recorded history. It's worth being precise about what's firmly established and what remains an area of ongoing research. The single ancestor origin is scientifically well supported for blue eyes specifically, based on Iberg's 2008 findings and later confirmatory research. Green eyes share the same underlying genetic toolkit and the same general timeline and geographic origin story. But because more genes and more variable pigment factors are involved, researchers describe green eye color as arising from a broader, more complex genetic combination, rather than one single identifiable founder event. Both traits, though, point back to the same fundamental fact. Lighter eye colors are a relatively recent development in human evolutionary history, likely no more than 10,000 years old, compared to the hundreds of thousands of years that anatomically modern humans have existed with predominantly brown eyes. This is also a useful moment to be honest about what a standard consumer ancestry test can and can't tell you. Those tests work by scanning your DNA at hundreds of thousands of specific known variant positions, called single nucleotide polymorphisms, and comparing your results against reference populations from different parts of the world to estimate regional ancestry percentages. That process is genuinely useful, but it typically won't walk you through the deeper migratory story behind a specific trait like eye color. A result might note some European or Central Asian ancestry in your background without ever connecting that to the specific mutation responsible for your eye color, or explaining that the same genetic variant sitting in your iris is also present in mountain villages thousands of miles away, carried there by people who never knew you'd exist. Some direct-to-consumer testing companies do. A few practical, well-documented notes are worth mentioning before wrapping up. Because green eyes contain less melanin than brown eyes, and melanin helps absorb and filter incoming light, people with green eyes, like those with blue and light hazel eyes, tend to be more sensitive to bright sunlight and glare, and often benefit more noticeably from sunglasses with strong UV protection. Lower melanin in the iris has also been studied in relation to slightly higher long-term risk for certain UV-related eye conditions, which is a reasonable practical reason to take sun protection seriously, regardless of how rare or striking your eye color is. Beyond that, Claims linking eye color to personality traits, pain tolerance, or other unrelated characteristics circulate widely online, but they are not supported by rigorous scientific evidence, and most researchers in the field treat them as unproven folk claims rather than established science. It's also worth noting that eye color itself isn't fixed for life the way most people assume. Many babies, particularly those of European ancestry, are born with eyes that appear blue or gray simply because melanin. It's also worth remembering that eye color is only one thread in a much larger genetic tapestry, and it happens to be one of the few traits simple enough to trace with real confidence, because it involves a small number of well-studied genes with clearly visible outward effects. Most traits, from height to disease risk, involve dozens or even hundreds of genetic variants working together in ways researchers are still mapping out, which makes eye color something of a rare gift to geneticists, a visible, easily measured trait that offers a genuine window into deep population history without requiring an invasive test or ancient bone sample. That's part of why it's remained such a popular subject of study for over 2 decades, from Iberg's original 1996 identification of the OCA2 region through the more advanced ancient DNA techniques being applied to the Kalash and other isolated populations today. What the actual research does support is remarkable enough without embellishment. A genetic switch that first appeared in a single human being somewhere near the Black Sea, sometime in the last 10,000 years, spread through migration, mixed into new populations, along ancient trade and settlement routes, and now show S up in the eyes of people across Ireland, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the mountain valleys of Central and South Asia. The specific green shade you might be looking at in the mirror right now is the product of ancient migration, a narrow biological balancing act between melanin, A, and lipochrome, and thousands of years of population movement that had nothing to do with the modern borders we now use to divide people into separate categories. Genetically speaking, those categories are far newer and far shallower than the traits themselves. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden history inside human DNA is something you want more of, subscribe to the channel because there's a lot more of it coming, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if you know someone with green eyes, send them this video because there's a good chance they've never actually been told where their eyes really came from.